what war has been effective since World War II?
You mean like American involvement or just war generally?
No.
The Algerian independence struggle, I would say, was an effective war by the Algerian resistance that led to the French being kicked out.
That was the resistance. Okay, so that's good. But okay, so then let's take it a step further. What war that we've been financing, funding, whatever,
been involved in? You mean? Well, that was successful. I would say the intervention in Yugoslavia led to a quick end of the conflict.
And how many people, right? Okay, but how did we interfere though? And what did we do? And was it the same as this?
We're for good things and against bad things.
We're against bad things.
Yes, absolutely. If there's one person who I think can attest to that and probably would agree that he is for good things and against bad things, at least I would hope so. I mean, we've never spoken with him before, but we're going to speak with him now, and we'll get a...
We've never met.
Just a little taste. Just a little taste.
Yeah, a little bit.
Dylan Burns, welcome to Generational Change.
Hello, I'm happy to be here, and you got to say I consider myself radically pro-good things and radically against bad things.
I can already tell you that you're a really terrible person because you have that total traitor right over your shoulder.
Oh, do you like Mikey Boy? Do you like Mikey Boy just hanging out in the background?
He's a disloyal person.
He's hiding at my place after dropping out.
I wonder if he's actually capable of getting a book deal. Like that would actually...
I know he released a book on the campaign trail to like show his image for the country like every failed candidate does, but I'm sure he could self-publish. I don't know who's bought his book. I'm sure he hands it out in like goodie bags or something. Maybe it's like a door stopper.
Giveaway bag. They probably do it at like the church white sales. They probably have them in like the auction basket.
The best one, honestly, was when Ted Cruz wrote his book, and I don't know if it was like his
mother.
Or his he had like a big donor that bought like 100,000 copies of the book to make it seem like...
Oh yeah, they get on the New York Times bestseller list. People do that all the time.
It's so bad.
So hey, we've never met. I've seen you on a couple of things here and there, but I didn't know. And then Peter had said you had reached out. So sometimes I'm a little skeptical. Like people want to come on here to be mean. They come on and want to be mean to me, but But I did a little research, and you're not seemingly somebody that's coming on here to be mean to me. So what is it that like sparked your interest in wanting to chat?
Oh, I saw your conversation with Lonerbox. Lonerbox is a good friend of mine. I hang out with him at Scotland. He showed me around. He showed me the Highland cows. Great guy. And when I was watching the conversation, and I'm somebody who very much wants the progressives to be more engaged in foreign policy conversations. I think foreign policy doesn't get much attention in domestic American media, even though America has so much influence on the world stage. I mean, the president coughs the wrong way, and it can cause an international crisis when we have military bases everywhere. We have extended deterrence with nuclear weapons covering over like 30 countries in the world. I think it's super important. And I saw you guys were talking a little bit about Ukraine, and I saw you guys were not too supportive of aid to Ukraine over problems with, the weapons industrial complex, the military industrial complex, profiteering or using this and using the Ukrainian people to profiteer being a major concern of yours. And I'm somebody who, I've been to Ukraine. I'm a war journalist. I covered the war on the ground. I think that supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. So I love engaging in constructive dialogue.
So what's been your experience? I'm assuming you've been to Kyiv and have seen what's been going on the ground. From our perspective, it's very simple. The longer these conflicts go on, the more innocent people end up getting killed. And it's always done in the purpose of cannon fodder, as, for political gamesmanship. And it's also done for the purpose of making money. That's how the war machine operates in the United States. And the way that, at least from where I stand, you see the way that NATO conducts business. I look at every foreign conflict as an opportunity to gain leverage over some type of natural resource, or could be a pipeline, whatever it is. What's happening in Ukraine is devastating, putting it nicely. And how it's going to end, I don't know. But what I do know is that the longer it goes on, it does seem that the body count just grows larger and larger, very much like what's going on in Gaza right now.
That's true. Anytime you're talking about financing any war or buying weapons from any defense company, the discussion of like perverse incentives for these companies to manipulate the body politic of the United States is a discussion you should have. And I want to make sure that any time when America gets involved in supporting an ally, the interest involved isn't this guy in a business suit who doesn't have America or the Ukrainian people's best interests at heart is pushing this forward because they want to sell weapons and make money. I understand that that could be something that's very scary, the idea of throwing all these lives away for these profiteering businessmen. But I also think that only viewing the world through that perspective is going to give you a very reductive foreign policy viewpoint. While it is true that the military industrial complex have interests and they do try to impact the body politic, there are other interests at play. For the Ukrainian people, if you were to ask them why they are fighting for, they're not fighting for the military industrial complex. They're fighting for it because they want to defend their homes, they want to defend their villages, and they want to liberate the towns and villages that were taken over by an imperial occupying force. And from their perspective, asking them why they're fighting, they can give you a million different reasons, whether it's Protestants saying that they want to fight against religious persecution. And I know many people in the Ukrainian Protestant community, whether it's people who have farms or villages and towns in occupied territory that they were displaced from. My good friend Bogdan, he was displaced from Donetsk, and the main reason he supports continuing the fight against the Russians is because he has no home to return to, along with millions of other Ukrainians. And I think that when it comes to Ukraine specifically, we have been generally reconciliatory with Ukrainians for about with the Russians for about 8 to 9 years. And that policy taken by both the Obama and Trump and even early Biden administration, I think, has been largely a failure. And I think it's time to let the Ukrainians take point over the struggle for their own freedom, both for American security interests, European security interests, and their own freedom, which I think it is also a moral struggle.
Yeah. I mean, don't look at, I mean, this is something that I've been, for me, it isn't just about the military industrial complex. There's a very long history here. It doesn't go back to Russia invading Ukraine, whenever that was 2 years ago, whenever that was. It goes out.
2014.
Right. It goes way before that. And there's been a history there as to between the people within Ukraine, people that are in Eastern Ukraine. They've been having their own issues. Like, I know enough to know that I don't know enough about it, and it is very complicated. Mm-hmm. But what I do know, to me, is that when our State Department's lips are moving, that's how you know it's lying. Mm-hmm. And so I will and also I'm probably a lot older than you. Okay. So I remember like everything from even before weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Now I get there are probably people in Ukraine that want the support. I get that. And I understand. That's unfortunate, that they're in this predicament. But the reality is, my understanding is that there were agreements that were made within that region that were not held to and not held, like people were not accountable for. And there's a lot of people within the eastern part of Ukraine that are very malcontent. And they have their own issues. That's not anything that had to do with Russia invading. Now, Russia, I think, has been clear about what they want. Now, going and being hyperbolic, like they're trying to take out Ukraine, they're trying to get all of Ukraine. No, they're not invading Russia. I mean, they're not invading Poland. They were very specific. And I just think, as somebody who is not an expert on this by any stretch, and we've had on people to talk about this, like we've had on military people, we've had on different people to talk about it. Medea Benjamin, whose book I read about this, which was very, very informative. She goes back.
Think it's a really bad book, but we can disagree about that. Yeah,
I mean, I'm just saying, so I understand that I do not know enough about this, but I do know, again, that when people are asking for aid and it's not going where it needs to go, and the people that are making the money are not it's not helping the Ukrainian people. It just isn't. And I also haven't heard of or seen any
that
strategy. No, but when we
said
had people talking about what is their end strategy? What is their plan? And they don't seem to have one.
They have a plan. Well, okay, there's a few things I wanted to talk about here. As for the idea that when the State Department talks, it's lying. I remember this logic used at the start of the invasion by a lot of commentators to dismiss concerns that were brought up by the American State Department that the Russians were going to invade in the first place. The American government was the first government to publicly say the Russians are preparing, our intelligence says so, they're gathering troops on the border. Even the Ukrainian government, I think to some extent, didn't even want to believe it because of what that could mean for the future of their country. But the American State Department was right. their intelligence assessments were right.
Why do you think they were right?
I think it's because that their signals intelligence is quite good in Russia. They're on persons and they're on the ground intelligence, so it's a little bit more shoddy. I think that's part of the reason why they didn't predict the outcome of what would happen when Russia invaded. Didn't know how.
Do you think that we have any sort of responsibility regarding any sort of provocation for any of this with us, with NATO, with any of that? Like, do we have any responsibility?
I think slight, but I don't think that was a major contributor to the war. The fact.
I don't think that was necessarily a contributor. I think they had a specific mission, Putin, and they had a specific mission what they were going to accomplish. I do think that the whole concept of NATO up their ass is definitely inflammatory. But I do think. Can
I comment on something earlier said I wanted to talk about like the aid not going to the people who need it? So I was in the Russian speakers. I've been to Eastern Ukraine. I've been to the Donetsk region. I've been to Zaporozhye. My first ever forward operating position I went to, it was with Russian speaking territorial defense. What I found in my time in Eastern Ukraine is the vast majority of people who speak Russian that I met, now, of course, this is my experience, and this is from my perspective, don't view the Russians very favorably. In fact, many of the aid workers that are most diehard aid workers I know used to view the Russians more favorably. And then after the invasion started, that kinship and brotherhood that they thought they felt kind of collapsed in on itself. I'm making a documentary about a friend of mine named Dima, who was sent to Russian speaking school because his mom wanted him to go to Moscow, because Moscow is the financial capital of this part of the world, and Moscow was going to give him all the opportunities. And he spent the opening months of the war evacuating civilians out of Mariupol as the Russians shelled the city and killed between 35 to 75,000 people. And so I think that the Russian-speaking narrative, if we were to imply it in any other country or put it in any other country, the dynamics would change. If we were to say, oh, well, the Irish speak English, so obviously that means their deep cultural ties to England are so deep that they want to. I
don't think that.
I'm not saying you think that. What I just want to put forward is, we don't have any solid evidence that in the regions where Russia invaded, the majority of that population wanted to necessarily be part of Russia. There certainly is a Soviet, definitely a nostalgic Soviet era part of the population, because there's a very old population, both Russia and Ukraine, because they had a demographic collapse after the Soviet Union, who have a kind of, nostalgia for the Soviet Union, that time of stability before the collapse. But it's that support, in my experience, was not widespread. That's also probably due to the fact that most of the people in that region that I was talking to are definitely people who are more involved in resistance. But I think I only met one person I've been in Ukraine for 2 years now, covering the war basically nonstop. I've only met one person who was a waiter in, I think, Chasiv Yar, who had real support for the Russians.
I mean, I appreciate all of that. I really do. But I go to, so what's our role in it?
I think our role is to fulfill the commitment we
war forever.
I think our goal is to finance them to have the best position, either to regain their country or when negotiations eventually happen, because all wars end with negotiation, to give them the best position to negotiate. Negotiating with the Russians, especially considering their track record, it's going to be necessary for the Ukrainians to have good leverage. And that's going to mean they have the ability to continue to defend themselves. If they don't, the Russians will take advantage of it, like they did in 2014, like they did in Moldova in the 1990s, like they did in Chechnya, like they did in Georgia. They have this tendency of freezing conflicts and then reigniting them when it's at their best advantage, when they've rebuilt their forces and when the West is distracted. So let's say, for example, there was a war between China and Taiwan, and we signed a ceasefire tomorrow in Ukraine. The West might be distracted with that, and during that opportunity, Russia takes advantage to then push that war again. And this isn't like far off scenarios. This is what happened in Ukraine in 2022, because the war originally started back in 2014.
Do you agree with friend of the show, Willie Bragg, 2014 is when the war started due to the CIA's toppling the government?
No, I think that's a bunch of horse hockey. I've talked to a lot of Euromaidan protesters. I looked at the evidence. I looked at the Victoria Nuland phone call and listened to it. And I thought the Victoria Nuland phone call, which is supposed to be the smoking gun for this theory, it pushed me in the opposite direction. It made me more positive that we did not motivate the government and tried to push the protesters to overthrow Yanukovych. Because in that phone call, they say pretty explicitly, we want the protesters to accept the deal offered by Klitschko. Klitschko was negotiating with the Yanukovych regime, and he found a deal to have elections like 6, 7, 8 months down the line while keeping Yanukovych in power. The protesters didn't trust it because after the murder of 100 protesters and him trying to outlaw protesting, they were scared that he was going to use that time in order to consolidate power. But the West thought that was the best deal that they were going to get, so they pushed the protesters to accept the deal. The deal looked at the West and basically said, screw you, kept protesting, and eventually they kicked Yanukovych out of the country. So it doesn't make sense for me for it being a CIA coup if the American government officials in these leaked calls were asking for the exact opposite thing to happen because they were fearful of, well, instability or the Russians using it as a justification to invade, which they ultimately did.
So with that said,
can I say one more? I'm sorry to do one more comment, but I wanted to talk about defense procurement.
To me, it just all comes down. The bottom line is, it just comes down to, even if everything, I will stipulate everything you're saying, and I still just don't see where this goes.
Sure,
and military people have commented, like, it's just not going anywhere. So
I
they're not NATO,
necessarily agree with that assessment, but about defense production, I was with the artillery crews that were using American cluster munitions, American M777 unitary shells. They treat that equipment like gold, because they know they don't have a lot of it, and most of their contemporaries, they have old Soviet 50, 60, 70-year-old guns that have been worn out with time, firing thousands and thousands of shells from the war in the Donbass. And so in my experience, when it comes to military aid, we have yet to find any real hard evidence, and this is both agreed to by both parties, even after appointing the Inspector General, they have yet to find any misattribution of funds when it comes to military aid. The real corruption stories in Ukraine, and this is why I have a problem with how sometimes aid is talked about, because when people talk about corruption in Ukraine, the image they have is almost comical, that we send over the tanks and then they're all going to be like sent to some terror group, or we send over these important cluster shells, and the Ukrainian government, when they need them to defend themselves, are going to send them to all these terror groups. Real corruption in Ukraine is contracts, government contracts, where a buddy in the Ukrainian government gives another buddy through a shell company contracts for production of goods that they don't have experience in, and so they whittle all that money down, don't spend it effectively, and then enrich themselves. That's what happened in some of the rebuilding efforts in Bucha. That's what happened with I think some military jackets funds from the Ukrainian budget. But when it comes to American military aid, that stuff is watched pretty carefully, and I don't think that those funds are being misallocated. At least I don't have any evidence of it. If you do, I'd love to hear about it.
Here's the evidence that I need, and it's the only evidence I ever care about.
Okay.
If these multinational corporations, whether it is, you take your pick, if Lockheed Martin is involved, if Raytheon is involved, if General Dynamics is involved, and I'm only using them on the surface. I go much deeper into this. Again, I wasn't prepared to have
Northrop Grumman or one of these other companies. Yeah.
Sure.
Any of them.
Point being is that their primary objective is to make money. And if the objective is to keep this going as long as humanly possible, if that means that they are in bed with, again, whether it's the Swiss banks, whether it's even, the banks in Ukraine, frankly, whether it's even banks in Russia, the goal is to always keep this going. Now, how much is true about how much of a say Boris Johnson actually had or could have essentially ended this thing within the first few weeks, and they said, no, this is not happening. We're going to win, whatever the fuck that means.
Right.
This is where we have, when I lived through Iraq and knowing what that was, and no two wars are the same. I understand that. But when you look at how that quagmire was something that never needed to happen in the first place.
Neither did this.
And this is something that will just go and go and go. And it's the little things, Dylan. It's the little things that come along. I don't give a flying F about, the people who want to play off this, oh, it's the Azov battalion, and that's why these guys are fighting. We got to get rid of the Nazis. It's this whole, no, I want to know what the actual deal is here. And the way I see it from the outside looking in, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline was a big fucking dumb move. And on top of that, you have so much rich resources in Ukraine, whether it's, I believe, wheat is a huge part of this. Cobalt, I believe, in terms of a natural mineral, is a huge one as well. Most of these fights, from my observation, always comes down to dollars and cents. The longer a war goes, the more money that is made and the more people that are killed. And that, to me, just from my perspective, again, you can disagree and that's fine. But I don't think there is any conceivable way, based on 2 years of evidence, that this is going to end any different than it is right now, that there is a conceivable way that this could possibly change the course in terms of where the war currently stands. That's where I stand. Could I be wrong? Certainly.
Time will tell.
And I respect the fact that you are over there, that you are on the ground, that you are willing to put in that work. A lot of people pontificate from a very safe distance. And the fact that you are willing to put yourself in harm's way, you have our respect. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we're going to agree universally in terms of where things are currently going. And I have a very anti-war streak because I've seen enough of war to know where a lot of this ultimately ends.
I also just don't think we need to be the world police. I really don't. I don't think it's just not our. And we're over there all the time, provoking, so that when something happens, we automatically have an obligation to be involved. But we really don't.
So war profiteering, as for war profiteering, ever since man has sold sharpened rock, other man has made profit for sharpened rock that were sold. And they've tried to find ways to sell as many sharpened rocks as physically possible. When you talk to the Ukrainians, their idea about it is we have to buy weapons from somewhere to defend ourselves. And the only providers of weapons, unless you have a national defense company like the Russians have to pump it out because they have their own military industrial complex that's more directly embedded in the state, when ours is more indirectly embedded in the state through lobbying. The Ukrainians have to buy the weapons from somewhere. There's nowhere they can go to that they can buy weapons from that there's not going to be a profit incentive. When we supported the Soviets during the Second World War, the people making money on selling those Jeeps and selling those guns and munitions, they were making money. And from their perspective, do they have a motivation in maybe helping to fight the Nazis? Sure. But for them, at the end of the day, they were businessmen making money. But those wars came to an end too, just like the Gulf War did, just like other wars did. I don't think the profit incentive in and of itself is enough to say that the war will go on forever, because there's other parties involved who have more direct involvement than the weapons defense companies, like the Ukrainians, who could not afford to have the war go on forever, who don't want the war to go on forever, and are trying to advance towards an idea of victory. And as for the victory plan revolves around isolating Crimea. It revolves around targeting the Black Sea Fleet, 20% of which they've sunken in the last 4 months. It involves around taking out their shipping capacity so they can transport goods and munitions to Crimea, and then taking out the Kerch Bridge with something like the Taurus missile to further isolate it and damage their supply lines. This type of strategy led to a successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv, the reclamation of tens of thousands of square miles of territory, and the reclamation of the only provincial capital that the Russians captured in the whole war, the city of Kherson. So they do have a strategy for victory. Zelensky laid out that strategy for victory recently in The Economist, as well as talking about the things they need for victory, which is going to be things like shells, air defense systems, Patriot air defense systems.
And I, by no means, as somebody who supports modern monetary theory, I by no means think that, it's our tax dollars funding the war in Ukraine, because I don't think that's not how this works. However, there's a difference between us giving them and them buying.
Yeah, we have the Lend-Lease and the aid program. Are they buying, or are we giving? But that aside, honestly, I don't see why this needs to involve us. I really think don't. Because we involved ourselves in the 90s when we went to the Ukrainians and we said, look, you have this nuclear arsenal, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. If you give it up, both us and the Russians will give you a guarantee of territorial sovereignty and will come to your aid if that territory is ever threatened. Now, I believe in nuclear nonproliferation. I believe the breakthrough between Lyndon B. Johnson and the Soviets in 1968 in the Nonproliferation Treaty was a gigantic achievement and shows that we can do real diplomacy with our allies. So that's a goal I want to pursue. I want as few failure points for nuclear weapons as well. Nuclear weapons is something that I found from this war that people are very much still concerned about. I am worried that if we don't commit and we don't go through on our commitment to Ukraine to protect their territorial sovereignty after giving up their nuclear weapons, and including cruise missiles that the Russians have used to bomb them because we made them give the cruise missiles to the Russians, I fear that the message that will be sent is, don't give up your nukes. The only way to guarantee your territorial sovereignty is nukes. Any other state saying that they're going to protect you with their umbrella or protect your sovereignty is nonsense. Everybody should just race for nuclear weapons, which if our goal...
We've already given that message. We gave that message years ago. Yeah. Was it Saddam Hussein? Was it Gaddafi? We gave that message years ago. Drop your weapons.
Yeah.
Well,
As much as I hate agreeing on this point,
So
if you have nukes, keep them.
so we should. So the goal. Wait. So your position is pursue nuclear weapons. Nation states should.
If you have nuclear,
I wouldn't give them up for an agreement with our country.
I'm
I
saying
wouldn't trust
if you
a
have,
word of
or
ours.
What about? But I mean, there's a lot of countries that didn't pursue nukes that then became part of our nuclear umbrella and now have participated in at least a period of prosperity, relative prosperity after European chaos in World War I and World War II. I don't think that I think that having less nation states with nuclear weapons is a pursuable goal. The Soviets and the United States realized this in the 60s. I remember JFK, I wasn't around at the time, but JFK made speeches in the 60s in pursuance of this treaty saying, if we don't pursue some treaty like this and try to stop the limitation of nuclear weapons around the world, we could have a situation where 50, 60, 70 countries in the world have nukes, and all we need is one nuclear arsenal to go haywire, some error. And if you read during the Cold War, man, that stuff is terrifying. I don't think this is an effort we should give up on.
No, but you know what? And you're totally right. Like in what you're saying, here's the problem. And I agree. We should definitely not be proliferating nuclear weapons. I'd like to see everybody disarm their nuclear weapons. It's not going to happen by the U.S. bullying it. And when the U.S. bullies it, they violate
how is this bullying? By sending Ukraine aid.
In particular isn't bullying. What I'm saying to you is when you have an agreement with the United States that if you give up your weapons, we'll protect you. At this point, for someone to believe that, that's like you're buying a used car from someone that you know is just the worst. Like it's a matter of that's not the way it's going to happen. It isn't a matter of whether I agree with it or don't agree with it. That's just not going to work.
Should Ukraine join NATO or not?
I wouldn't believe you.
Me personally, I think if they could join NATO, they should join NATO. Yes. Okay. So for their own national security interests. Yes.
Well, that would be my red line. Absolutely not.
Why not?
Because that's World War III.
That seems a little hyperbolic to say that them joining NATO after the war would necessarily start World War III.
No, that was sort of the hard line.
That was not their hard line very recently. In 2002, Vladimir Putin said, and Lavrov said shortly after, that if Ukraine was to join NATO, that was ultimately their decision. They also said in 2008 that there was no ethnic conflict in Ukraine. That position changed once they got into a position of power and felt like they could go out and start rebuilding empire. So
let me push back on you, Dylan, because you have to remember that a big part of this whole debate, bless you, the whole point of, is this a question? Again, everyone has an opinion when it comes to why did our country do what it did? Why did Russia do what they did, and so on? And of course, Ukraine is just stuck in the middle, which is the case in so many foreign conflicts that we see.
Yeah, but let's be clear. The Ukrainians want to go one path. They want to go the path anti-oligarchy. They want to go European. They want to go a certain path, and the Russians are saying no. I think it's their decision to determine to go forward with the path that has been more successful for them.
I have no problem.
But the Russians, they can't have that individual sovereignty until the Russians stop invading Ukraine and they can join things like the EU. This whole war started because the Russians invaded Ukraine.
I think that if Joe Biden and our government really didn't want this war to be happening, that they could have done a lot to stop it a long time ago. And whether or not that would involve some concessions to Russia that Ukraine doesn't want to make, I don't know what the negotiation would be. But I know it could have been done with a lot less death and destruction.
Could have been done in the first few weeks.
Exactly. And
I think that's really misinformed.
Whether or not, and again, I think, how old are you? I'm just curious. How old are you?
I'm 22 years old.
Okay. So, and I don't look, I have a son who's 23 years old. Honestly, so it's just what
you
it
shock
comes
people with that, Jen.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that what no, I don't think that's
everyone thinks you're young.
No, I'm not. I'm old and I'm more than old enough to be your mother. And it's just like your thoughts on this are so like pure. Like I totally respect what you're saying. And at one point, I'm sure when I was a certain age, I probably would have agreed with that. But I feel like when you get to a certain point and you've seen enough, and I do not say this in any way condescendingly because it isn't, it's just seriously, I can't buy it anymore. I've bought it enough times. And most people and anybody in the thread who is like, I would say over the age of 40 ain't buying it again. And that's
well,
really
the majority
what
of
the problem
Ukraine's
is.
support comes from people over their 40s in the United States.
Yeah, diehard libs, your Democrats. Yes, they're gonna go with their Ukrainian flags on their profile picture.
So Dylan, let me.
By the way, also wait. Let me just. There's a few other things I wanted to talk about the Boris thing. Boris didn't sink negotiations. This comes from a Pravda article from an anonymous source, and at the same time this was going on, and there's been multiple statements both from the Israeli Prime Minister that people cite and from the Israeli government officials in question that it was Bucha that was the last straw. That once that death pit was uncovered and the Ukrainians realized what occupation would mean for much of the country, they couldn't sign a contract or any deal that would allow that land to be in Russia's hands because they were scared of the death pits. And so I don't think the Boris Johnson going and meeting with Zelensky was a primary motivator in them not accepting a deal. I believe that there's a lot more Western leaders that would want a deal with the Russians, and the Ukrainians are the ones more than anyone who didn't want to accept a deal after that. So I don't think Boris Johnson was that much of a motivator. And as for the resources thing about this being a war of resources, ultimately, I think it should be the Ukrainians that control their resources. I think that at the end of the goal,
it's not our business ultimately to make.
I think we made it our business by going, and so now we're saying we're going to do what America always does, and what people are saying, and I'm hearing this from people who thinks it's unfortunate, but we're going to turn around and abandon them, and then when they
we need to do something for them differently than what we're doing. I don't think we should abandon them.
You know, the funny thing about what's going,
this isn't working.
You know, the funny thing about
what do you mean it has worked. It has worked.
No,
I think it
isn't working. If it worked, we would still be. How many Ukrainians are dead because of this?
600,000.
That's I don't know where that number came from, but the number is estimated between the number we don't know, but it's probably somewhere around 100,000 or somewhere around that number. It's hard to tell because the UN can't access occupied territory.
Guys, if anybody in the chat or Colin, if you have any verification, anything that's from multiple sources about
I'm on team those people. Okay, so in my mind, as someone,
but you don't agree with those people.
What?
But you don't agree with those people.
Oh no. It has nothing to do with whether I agree with them or don't agree with them. I don't care about their politics one way or another. My thought in my mind is what's going to save the most people. And what's going to save the most people is us fighting our own government to go and do what it should have done in the first place, was to take a diplomatic stand and bring Putin to the table and get this shit in order.
What happens when the Ukrainians say no? What happens when the Ukrainians say no?
You know what? If the Ukrainians don't want to work with us and what we're doing, then they don't get our help. It's like this. I have a kid, right? You want the help? You're on the payroll? That's the deal. My opinion counts. And I do not think we should leave them. I think that we should.
This is being done out of interest for them, right? This is to save lives. We're going to make the Ukrainians accept a deal, an occupation that they don't want, because we don't want them to sacrifice that.
You force them to maintain whatever their election was, whatever the vote was that they had that wasn't installed, or whatever, or have another election, or have whatever.
What do you mean another? But this is the fear that Ukrainians have. They saw the death pits, they saw the torture, they saw what happened, and if they make a deal which allows the Russians to keep that occupied territory, they're just going to enshrine that behavior in occupied territory when they're fighting a post-colonial struggle.
I don't know that. And I'm going to tell you why I don't know that, because when I hear you talking like that, and I appreciate that it is a legitimate concern, I do. But it is very reminiscent to me of when I hear the Zionists saying, if we don't get them, they're going to get us.
Well, we have a proven track record of castration, of hammer executions, of death pits that have been uncovered. The largest mass grave uncovered in Europe since the Yugoslav genocides was uncovered in Izium. Over 444 bodies, many of which with their hands tied behind their backs and bullets in their skulls. We have no reason to believe that that behavior is stopped in occupied territory.
So let's say that is the case, and that we need to protect them for that, because I agree that's horrible. So we need to do something to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, here's where the disconnect is for me. I don't see how maintaining a war that is not seemingly going anywhere, and we can't seem to get an answer for strategy, is going to accomplish that goal. And I do agree that the goal is to prevent Ukrainian people from dying. Like I said,
100%.
I am on team whoever it is who's dead and their families. And so what I'm saying to you is, in my world and life experience, more arms, more war, that is not the solution, and it doesn't lead to a better outcome. That's just my life experience.
So you're
I agree with what you're saying.
You believe that more war in any instance always leads to a worse scenario.
I believe that since World War II, yes.
So World War II was the only war worth fighting since then, you would say?
Again, it might be a war worth fighting for the people there, but in terms of our involvement in it, it should be diplomatic. It should be forcing our hand, using our bully pulpit, using our power with the world. We don't do it because we don't want to. How
does this not create a world where might makes right?
No, that's all it's doing is creating a world that might makes right now.
If we say Russia invades Ukraine, and if they don't accept if they're not willing to accept our diplomatic settlement where they sign away who knows how much land, but sign away presumably at least the land that the Russians control now. Then
let me ask you, what is there? See, again, I don't hear any strategy.
Can I say
the strategy? I said the strategy was to isolate Crimea's logistics by destroying the Black Sea Fleet, 20 of which they've destroyed in just the last 4 months.
They can do that.
I can't give you a hard date any more than anyone who fought any war can give you a hard date on when the war is going to end. But that's how wars are fought. Wars are not fought on tight time schedules. Wars are fought for goals that need to be seeked out.
What war has been effective since World War II?
You mean like American involvement or just war generally?
No.
The Algerian independence struggle, I would say, was an effective war by the Algerian resistance that led to the French being kicked out.
That was a resistance. Okay, so that's good. But okay, so then let's take it a step further. What war that we've been financing, funding, whatever.
Been involved in, you mean? Well, that was successful? I would say the intervention in Yugoslavia led to a quick end of the conflict.
And how many people, right? Okay, but how did we interfere though? And what did we do? And was it the same as this? It wasn't really.
It wasn't the same because there wasn't a nuclear power involved so this way we have to interfere more or get involved more indirectly.
I just don't think the way to be involved is more fighting. Like I
think that it's just I feel that the idea that all wars that come, the one solution is just going to be ending it as soon as possible because death is bad. There's other factors at play here. People in Ukraine don't want to live under occupation. If they don't,
and that's fine. They'll live during the war.
Well, then that's what they're willing to do. The last Kiev Sociology Institute poll came out that said 2 out of 3 Ukrainians said that if all Western aid to Ukraine stopped, they should continue to fight the Russians until they reclaim everything. So my view on this is if we stop sending aid, there's a real risk that the Ukrainians will just say, politically, demographically, when it comes to the future of our country, we don't want to lose 80% of our country, our coastline to become a rump state, and they're going to keep fighting, but then with less support, which then is just going to lead to more people dying. I remember going back to Kharkiv the second time. I was there the first time when the electrical grid was getting targeted. It was awful. It was terrible. The city was getting regularly shelled. Then the Ukrainians pushed the Russians away from Kharkiv during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and then when the city was no longer in range of artillery, more civilians came back. The city started to prosper more. So if we're going to talk about how to save civilian lives, as of right now, until we know that the Russians are really serious about coming to a real compromise with the Ukrainians that both sides can live with, then we have to support them in their resistance to give them the best position to negotiate.
Two things. So the expansion of NATO to Russia's border, which effectively would have been bringing Ukraine.
We're already at Russia's border in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, and Finland now.
So it's been expanding for hundreds of miles when it was not supposed to.
According to who?
That is our role that we have played in basically poking the bear.
Lots of things.
And to me, that is a huge part of the equation, Dylan. And then the other question I would have is: would you greenlight American troops getting involved in this conflict?
No, I wouldn't greenlight American troops getting involved in this conflict. And the Ukrainians aren't even asking for American troops to get involved in this conflict. They're asking for equipment so they can fight the struggle themselves and we can fulfill our commitment we made to them in the 90s when they asked them to give up their nuclear arsenal, which I think, again, for nuclear non-proliferation and just sticking to our word is an important thing to do. Not to mention, European stability is, people talk about national security interest is such a buzzword, but European security is genuinely an American national security interest. Our main export is Europe. the majority of our goods that are exported go to Europe. Outside of the United States, the euro is the second largest world reserve currency. This is not just a question about your Ukrainian stability or Ukrainian security. This is also a question about European stability. If you listen to Putin's speech at the start of the war, he said that every post-Soviet state's borders was created artificially. This is an ideological foundation to go past Ukraine. And people think, oh, that's fear-mongering. I'm not saying that they're going to move into Estonia, but when you talk about countries like Moldova, which are not in NATO and already have Russian soldiers illegally stationed within them, and they've been funneling money into it for years, I do think it's a real concern. The Moldovans think it's a real concern. The Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians think it's a real concern. And if we retract from this continent and just say, you know what, we're going to just focus on American issues, if our interest is nuclear nonproliferation, the message that's going to be sent is you're not covered by the American nuclear arsenal. Get your own nukes, race for it. And that's something that I think is bad for Americans. I think that's bad for Europeans. I think it's bad for the world.
I think it's also fair to say that because our country, and you're in Baltimore, is that correct? Or that's where you're from?
I'm from Maryland.
Okay. So it's fair to say that we also have a really strong anti-war streak in this country that's been growing steadily, and it's been growing much more steadily on the populist right. But I think a big reason for that is because so many families were adversely affected by the war in Iraq, and that's where a lot of that fervor tends to come from. I also think because we live in a country without health care, without a living wage, without a real jobs program for working people that can sustain dignity, among other things, like retirement and whatnot. When you take a lot of these things into account, criminal justice, the environment, and so forth, it's easy to see why so many people want to have these conflicts come to an end as soon and as swiftly as possible. So if we can put a bow on this, and you're putting your hat on of, let's say, peace negotiator, how would you want this conflict to end in the soon, and what would be the most realistic circumstance?
As realistic to do it as soon as possible?
What would be?
To get a ceasefire, because a peace, I would make a differentiation between a peace deal and a ceasefire. Because if you just cease fighting and then start fighting again in 6 months, you've not really solved anything. You got to pack.
No, but if
right?
you have a ceasefire, once fighting stops, the easier it is to make it stop completely. That's a fact.
It can be, but also there's nothing necessarily, unless we put something durable in there to stop this, there wouldn't be anything necessarily stopping the Russians from reigniting the war once we had lost attention, which, according to Russian military doctrine, that has been the strategy throughout the post-Soviet world before, and we have no reason to believe that the Russians have necessarily given up on their original goals, especially if they think the West is losing interest. As for what was your other question besides the peace deal? Getting a peace deal as soon as possible right now would probably be some version of a ceasefire between the Ukrainians and the Russians, where the Russians at the very least control what they have right now. Whether that would lead to a sustainable ceasefire would depend upon whether or not there was anything strong stopping the Russians from invading again, like a unilateral defense pact between the United States and Ukraine, or the United Kingdom and Ukraine, or, and this is why I say this, NATO membership, because no NATO member state has ever been invaded by the Russians, and it's the only 100% guaranteed so far strategy to stopping Russian invasion, which is why the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, and all these countries joined in the first place after the Russians reasserted themselves in Chechnya, bombing it and making it the most destroyed city in the world, according to the UN. That was if you look at a lot of NATO member states, when did they join? 1999, the same year when the Russians, Chechnya.
Well, hey, listen, a friend of our show, Firmware, says that you should debate Scott Ritter on this.
Yeah, Scott Ritter.
I'm not a debate person. I don't claim to be an expert on things. I think
I'm 22. I'm a little old for Scott.
Is that I don't know enough about him or anything about that. I don't know anybody. I don't know.
Don't worry about it.
I only know who that is.
My problem with Scott Ritter is Scott Ritter has made a lot of predictions, most of which have not come true from the start of the war about immediate collapse. Same thing with Douglas McGregor. Douglas McGregor has predicted the collapse of Ukraine 12 times, the immediate collapse of Ukraine like 12 times now, at the start of the war and multiple times. At a certain point, you got to look at it a boy cry wolf situation. This is the same Douglas McGregor, which also regularly appears on Russian state TV. This is the same type of person I think Scott Ritter is. I debate him any day of the week, though. I would love to talk to Scott Ritter. There
you go. We should set that up. If we can, I don't know him, so I
also want to see you debate Max Blumenthal, which would also be interesting.
I'd be happy to talk to Max. I know Max is. Oh wait, no, he's not having a debate. That's someone else. Sorry, I was thinking of Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah, no, Max is.
Or Glenn, yeah. I mean, listen, you know, at the end of the day, this is the worst part of war. Double K, we love you.
It is.
And Dylan, you know your stuff, man. I'm
Absolutely.
not going to take that away from you.
Can I throw one thing out there? I got involved in politics, and many people are surprised when they hear how diehard of a Ukraine supporter I am, on the Bernie Sanders campaign and the Mike Gravel campaign. I was a Gravel kid, which I think when many people see my diehard support for Ukraine, that kind of throws them a curveball, because I concentrate on Ukraine, so people just see me like beating the drum on this and concentrating on this issue. But up until now, one of my main issues going into 2020 was stopping all American weapon shipments to Saudi Arabia to stop the bombing of Yemen. I am opposed to continued American weapon shipment to Israel for the Gaza Strip. I think that we have never properly leveraged our aid against Israel since Ronald Reagan, which is a crazy thing to say, but when they invaded southern Lebanon, he said, I'm going to stop sending jets.
That's
Biden's
true.
not willing to do what Ronald Reagan did.
No. That's never going to happen now. Now they're doubling and tripling down on their genocide at this point.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to Ukraine, and we're talking about ending aid because of domestic American politics issues, something that's really hard for me to communicate with people is how much of our budget foreign aid actually makes up. According to Pew Research, if you poll Americans and you just ask them with no information, how much money of our budget do you think we spend on foreign aid? They get between 20 to 25% of our budget being spent on foreign aid.
Yeah, it's like 3%.
It's 1%. It's a crazy small amount in the grand scheme of things. And when we're talking about
not military aid.
No, military aid as well. I'm including military aid in this. If you include Ukrainian aid, it maybe I think would be 1.2% now or something. Either way, American aid to Ukraine in the grand scheme of things when it comes to the federal budget, definitely when we're talking about sending them things like ATACMS and old Vietnam troop era carriers, these were built 60, 50, sometimes like 30 years ago. The stuff that is more modern produced stuff is mostly the artillery shells or some of the air defense missiles that are being sent over. So when we're talking about these things that are being sent over, stopping this aid, stopping these troop carriers from being sent over, isn't going to bring about Medicare for all. It isn't going to stop military aid to Israel. It isn't going to solve any of these issues. All that's really happened if we stop this aid to Ukraine is that Ukraine will feel abandoned. Ukraine will have to be put into a harder position to fight the Russians. And who knows if they'll be able to defend their skies against what is right now the largest bombing campaign of the war that the Russians have launched. So it's something that really concerns me.
Yeah, and again, I support what you're doing, and like we said, we support Ukrainian people. We just don't agree on the best way to do that. We don't agree on what's the strategy to do that. So that's really what we're talking about here. It isn't that I have a problem with Ukrainians, right, or anything about that, right? I just don't agree with their strategy.
I actually would like to see you. I mean, listen, I don't like giving him any attention whatsoever. He's just somebody who I think is.
You say Hinkle.
Did you really say Jackson Hinkle?
I did say Jackson Hinkle. Because everybody everybody I know doesn't like Jackson Hinkle because he has horrible. You know my experience with Jackson Hinkle, and this is my experience with Jackson Hinkle. I confronted him on money he took from an award which is tied to the Assad family. I'm like, hey, this is really bad. Assad murdered like 400,000 people. It's not good that you took that money. And his response to getting pressured about that was going after my mother's heroin addiction, which killed her. He is a very low level, really, I would just say scummy guy. I don't like him, but I'd be happy to debate him any day of the week because I don't think he particularly knows what he's talking about.
All right, wait. I just really have, because guys, we talk about Jason Hickel a lot on this show, and I really want to make sure that we are not confusing Jackson Hinkle with Jason Hickel. So I'm just saying, because Jason is extremely bright, and I'm just saying.
One of the worst.
Are you familiar with Jason Hickel?
I am not familiar with Jason Hickel.
I look him up. And honestly, he's amazing. Like it's more about like economics and stuff like that. But just somebody like if you were a Mike Gravel person and you were in that sort of mindset, you would very much appreciate Jason.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because I wanted to ask one question because my friends over there are getting hurt. They're dying. If I could and snap my fingers and end the war tomorrow, I would. I just don't think that if they were to sign a ceasefire deal under the terms and conditions that Putin would agree to right now, that would be long-term peace. I think it would delay the war, extend the war, and give Russia breathing room as we all pat ourselves on the back. But putting that aside, I want to know if we were to end the war and we were to bring this to a close, how would you guarantee the Russians don't just do what they did every other time and invade when we're not paying attention anymore? What's the durable structure we could put in place that would make the Russians say, you know what, it's not worth it?
Well, what I can tell you in terms of Russia's economy, they are significantly dependent. I mean, again, it's the biggest nation in the world by landmass. With that said, most of what they rely on has to do with agriculture and with fossil fuels. So we as a nation are so far behind the rest of the world when it comes to our infrastructure. And don't get me started on that infrastructure bill that the Biden administration passed. It is shit.
Yeah,
shit.
we're not counting that.
So if you're going to change your structure where you actually hold leverage, let's say, over a nation like Russia, you don't want to be dependent on foreign oil. You don't want that foreign oil being traded amongst the European nations. Well, I got to tell you, when I look at a nation like China, what I do see is a nation that has their shit together when it comes to infrastructure. The fact that we have no high-speed rail in this country and that we are not making that alone a priority. The fact that we have no interest, well, it's not that we don't have interest, it's just recognizing that our country is completely captured by corporate special interest money, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, because of the interests that they have. So if we're in a situation where we're not even talking about the prospect of utilizing some type of a national push for nuclear power to get off of coal and natural gas and obviously oil, then therein lies where the whole opportunism of so goes America, so goes the rest of the world, that is slowly but surely changing. This is turning into something where now so goes Russia and China, so goes the rest of the world. And that is a very dangerous position to put ourselves in. Whereas, again, as you said, sometimes might can make right, even though that should always be the last resort. If we are not drastically changing how we execute our infrastructure growth in this country, this is only going to get worse. Okay, so we passed the CHIPS Act. Maybe we're going to catch up a little bit when it comes to technology, but that's nowhere near where we need to be. And so if we're not on that growth path where we can say, okay, if Russia's going to fuck with you, we're going to make sure that that energy source that they're trying to basically hold over your head, well, it's not going to be so valuable anymore because we've already caught up and we're ahead of that now. So to me, this is where I understand where everyone who comes together on the issue of endless spending on our military power is ultimately going to be the end of us. Why? When you have 800 bases around the world and China and Russia combined have, I think, 30, that's not good. No. That's not doing us any favors. And while I'm not saying that we are solely responsible for what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in Israel, I can definitely say that because of the trajectory we've moved on, probably since the end of World War II, it's easy to see how we've ended up where we are and why things are so bad and why it always seems to get worse every day. So until we put our foot down and say, this is where the line is getting drawn, we have to get to the negotiating table. I'm sorry. A lot of those things you said about infrastructure and about investing more, like I agree with all of that, but I don't feel like any of that addressed my question, which was. No, I don't either.
I'm going to tell you, like, you want to know how do we enforce what Russia would.
How do we stop the Russians from invading again once we made this deal? Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think that's, well, no, you said we need to have more like sort of to hold over their head. And I get that. That is definitely
but I don't understand how energy would, the Russians are exporting their energy to like, I don't know what we would, how that would stop them from invading again. To be honest with
you, I think that this is, look, this is one of those things that when you say, how would we ever trust anybody to enforce anything? And the truth is you can't because we don't ever keep anything. But I do think that when you have people that know what they're doing and actually are trying to help the people. See, right now, we don't have a team in this country that gives a rat's ass about the Ukrainian people. So if our administration and our Congress and our people really gave a shit about the Ukrainian people, there would be a lot more talk about diplomacy and a lot more different things and people using their power of their position and their platform to do other things. And instead, we'd rather just finance our military.
I feel diplomacy is such a simple answer. There have been 200. There have been 200. There have been 200 rounds of negotiation, over 20 attempts at negotiated ceasefires, and that was up to 2022. Past then, there have been more rounds of negotiations and more discussions, both through back channels and through public statements through the press, as we've seen now with the New York Times. I don't think the solution is just saying negotiate harder. Something I believe that the interests at play between Russia and Ukraine are so vastly different that negotiating at this stage could, as far as I'm afraid of, just extend the conflict. I don't think the solution is just talking harder.
I understand what you're saying, but what I'm saying is the problem is that when you're talking about how many hours of negotiation, I can guarantee you nobody from this
200
country,
rounds, not hours, rounds of negotiation.
it could be, Dylan, it could be forever. It could be a whole year of meetings. And I can assure you that nobody representing this country
That was 8 years of
has
meetings.
any interest in ending the problem. They only have an interest in keeping it going. So to me, when you talk about what solves the problem, it's having leadership that
I don't even know what that
has
means. When you say people in this country don't want to end the war,
the people that are negotiating over there, not the people in the country.
People in power.
I honestly, I think if Joe Biden could end this war, he would. It's just the problem. The problem, I think if he could end the war on terms that would be acceptable to the Ukrainians right now, he would. I think it'd be in interest of his reelection campaign. I think it'd be the interest of America geostrategically. I think it would be the interest of America looking credible on the world stage when it comes to us fulfilling our commitments. I think it would make sense from his position on non-nuclear proliferation. I mean, Joe Biden was the guy who pulled out of Afghanistan against the advice of multiple security advisors who were yelling at him, don't pull out, it'll go bad. He did it anyway, took a massive beating in the media for it. I don't think out of all the presidents in the world that I'm going to point to and say, he just wants to support Ukraine because he just wants the military industrial complex to profit.
No, I don't think that's the only reason he wants to support Ukraine. I think he wants to support Ukraine because it's just like the proper thing to do in his mind. But I do think that there's people that the people that are at the negotiating table, okay, are not interested in stopping this.
I also don't believe that Biden is in charge.
There's that too.
I believe Blinken's in charge, and he's calling the shots.
There's that.
And he's calling the shots with a plethora of other people.
I don't know if it was Blinken, because Blinken was calling the shots. I don't know if he would have withdrawn from Afghanistan.
And listen, as far as I'm concerned, it's like anything. Eventually, you got to get out of Iraq. Eventually, you got to get out of Afghanistan. Eventually, what's happening in Yemen, which is a genocide as well, has to end as well. And everything just moves in pieces and pieces and pieces. You've only got so much because remember, so much of our military today is based on money being spent. It's not about boots on the ground. This is very different in a lot of ways. Doesn't mean that couldn't happen. And let me tell you something. What's happening right now with Israel's decision, they could say whatever they want about how they killed number 2, whoever the fuck in Hamas. But the fact of the matter is they bombed Beirut. And by doing that, this could very easily expand into a very hot war very quickly.
Yeah.
And so by that measure, there's no telling what might end up happening. Every action leads to a reaction. And might doesn't always make right. And an eye for an eye makes the world blind. Yeah. Ultimately, our sympathies and support are with the Ukrainian people who are stuck in the middle of this shit. That's what it comes down to.
We just don't have the same mindset about what's actually happening that you do in terms of
what's
the people
actually
that are
happening.
running the show. Well, in terms of when you talk about the people behind the scenes that are calling the shots and financing stuff and having the meetings and having negotiations, I don't think that we really know what goes on there. In fact, I know we don't.
I think there's a limit to how much we actually know.
I don't know. Okay, you say we know, but you also said earlier we know that the weapons we're sending over are being misallocated. But there's not any evidence of that. You said
that there's no aid going to the Ukrainians. We know the weapons are going exactly where they're meant to go. The only people benefiting are the military industrial complex. The people in Ukraine aren't benefiting from that.
How do we know these things? I think that's saying a lot. That's saying that very confidently that we know the real interests at play. I don't think we do truly know all of the real interests at play.
That's fair.
Absolutely.
But what I will say is that I've seen enough of these particular multinational corporations over several decades in terms of their interests and what matters most to them to draw what is called in science a theory, a reasonable conclusion to the evidence that's been presented to you. Do I have all the evidence? No. When it comes to just us as the general public, in terms of what goes on with the powers that be, the average person in the world probably knows, if they're lucky, they know 5% of what's really going on. We are privy to a very small percentage of what really goes on. We can surmise why things are being done the way that they're being done.
And like I think our perception, and specifically my perception on politicians, politics, human nature, how things work, how people negotiate, how businesses operate, how things interact, again, that's where this comes to like a whole different lifetime of wisdom and experience. And it just is what it is. Like,
I understand that you are older than me. That is true. But as much as my youth might create my naivete, I would say age can also create cynicism. It can. I know many old people who used to be like super progressive, who when they're young and then they get old and they're Reaganites now, and now they're.
Dylan, I get further and further left every day. I'm gonna fall off the edge.
She's gonna fall off the edge.
So I'm telling you, I'm as progressive left as you could. I am like I'm telling you. Okay, so I'm not getting old in terms of that. And I'm not cynical,
for me,
I'm skeptical.
The dynamics of this war, I feel like, are so, I feel like the left is unprepared sometimes for a serious foreign policy discussion about Ukraine and about NATO and about the future of these organizations. Because
I'm happy to have it, but the truth is this is not something that like I claim to be an expert on.
No, I'm not claiming that you're an expert on.
Yeah,
it's just,
and we never did. I don't even do debates because I don't. This isn't something that
I think sure. We can end on this note, Dylan, and this has been a great conversation. It's necessary to have these conversations.
He told me you wanted to come on and talk to me about Israel-Palestine because that's something that's sort of like my thing.
In my email, I explicitly said that I'm not an expert on Israel-Palestine, and it would be hard for me to talk extensively about it.
Wait, what did you say? You don't know that one?
In my email, I said I don't know nearly as much about Israel-Palestine as much as I know about Ukraine.
No, that's fine. But I also think that these conversations are very important because if there's one thing that really hurt Bernie, in my opinion, especially when he ran.
Wait, can I ask one question? It just hit me in the face, and I have to ask it. Yeah. How? And this is something that I asked this in all earnest. How can you both say you know what's going on while also saying I'm not an expert? Because that's something that I fear a lot when I go into a new field.
I don't say I know what's going on in terms of facts. What I say is I have an instinct about human nature, human behavior, past experience. How people maintain agreements, who's being honest, who's full of shit, what someone's real motives are. That is the stuff that I feel like I see at a very different perspective than you. I'm not talking about knowing facts or knowing strategy as much as I'm talking about human behavior and motivation.
You might have better instincts than me. That might be true.
That's all I'm talking about. And I've said it. And look, I would have told you in the beginning, I by no means am an expert on Ukraine. And here's the thing. If I were your congressperson, don't do it right now. If I were your congressperson, what I would have happen is I would have you and I would have a whole bunch of other people that know this come in and sit down and have a really good conversation and hash out some really good policy and come up with solutions. And
can I offer you a compromise I think we might be able to agree on?
Sure.
Okay. So there are $300 billion worth of Russian assets that are frozen within Europe and the United States. Now, Russia has made itself very clear that they think this whole war is Ukraine's fault and they're not going to be paying for Ukraine's reconstruction. Do you think that money should be taken and once the war is over, or even before the war is over, and dedicated towards Ukraine's reconstruction, since Russia's not going to pay reparations?
Sure. Exactly.
Okay.
That's like, here's the thing. I am a bleeding heart hippie. Really, that's me. And so my thing is going to be, what can we all do to come together to help the least of these? I am never going to be about, I got me mine, my place of the pie. I'm not with that. So you're never going to have me arguing with you over what the intent is in terms of what the goal is, right? Like what the mission is going to be to help as many people as possible. You'll never get an argument. I
know a lot of progressives are very fearful about things like sanctions or seizing assets and stuff like that.
Oh, no, I have no problem with that. But like, I am a person who is about justice, but I also would really need to have a lot more research and information. So again, like you would be, let's say, part of some panel and I would have you come in and we could talk about it and I'd get research and I would also have read a lot more and be a lot more knowledgeable about this. And then you come up with some actual solutions based on people who really know their shit. Okay, so, and I don't claim to be that, but I do have a certain amount of skepticism when it comes to foreign policy from our standard, from our perspective as American empire, and as somebody who actually really is on the left of left. So I see it like when you look at how you see about Russia, to me, I don't care what language my oligarchs speak, man. The problem to me is capital. So
See,
when
this is the problem I have with leftists sometimes, is that they disregard a lot of times the importance of nationalism in certain countries. And the portion. Well, wait. Can I finish? Can I finish my sentence quickly?
Sure.
Is I understand that oligarchs in the corrupt and money countries, they are like parasites. They take from the public dollar. They dodge taxes. And honestly, if we were to talk tax policy, there's probably a good chance we agree on 95% of issues, right? I consider myself very left-wing economically. But I will say that in this instance, and I just want to emphasize this, even if this is not what you believe, this is not a situation of like just changing a flag. These systems of government that Ukraine and Russia have are vastly different. The ability for a civic society to exist in Ukraine does exist. I meet the journalists who get criticized often by Ukrainians, by some more nationalist Ukrainians, like the Kiev Independent, who publishes pieces saying the government is not readily investing into defenses enough. Then the government's had this corrupt dealing go off. That type of reporting cannot be done under occupied territory. The type of civic society where Ukrainians can build upon labor action or build upon the future of the country, that doesn't really exist in occupied territory.
That doesn't exist here. Like what
no, not this. This is America centrism right now. This is an American centric view. There is a huge difference between the institutional discouragement of protests and what happened with Bernie Sanders, Adana Brazil, and certain things that the American government or elites do to deal with dissent, and taking someone out back and shooting them in the back of the head and dumping them in the pit.
No,
there's a big difference there.
We are creeping, but let me tell you something.
Yeah.
I was recently in Atlanta for the Cop City protest. We are in that trajectory of right-wing authoritarianism, and that is something that is happening globally and is very concerning to me. And so when I don't necessarily focus, and I acknowledge this, I cannot be a jack of all trades, but like when we're talking about like Russia, they're not the boogeyman to me that they might be to you. That's what I'm saying. Like I see us as way more of a boogeyman than Russia. Like to me, American
In what
empire,
part of the world?
In every part of the world.
In Europe?
America, if you were to ask people, no, not in our ally places, no. In places like, let's say, and I hate saying the global South because that sounds so like, you know.
That's
like,
where the majority of the people live.
but what I'm saying is, if you ask people what country they'd be concerned as a threat to world peace, they say us.
And much of the world,
Russia.
that is true. They do think that we're a threat to world. I will say though, but let's zoom this in for a moment. When we talk, if we go to Europe and we talk about the neighbors that are bordering Russia and you ask them, they're going to answer Russia. If you go to the countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, or really any country that's anywhere near China, and you ask them who is the main threat to stability, who would you rather be the world leader, they're going to say we want the United States to be the leader in the region. We don't want China to be the leader in the region. It depends on who you're asking and their personal geopolitical interests. That's why, for example, I'm not against, say, the Chinese doing some peace mission and somewhere that could actually help people, but I also am not going to be against the United States sticking with its allies and standing with Ukraine when it's illegally invaded on a quest looking for weapons of mass destructions and the bioweapons that the Russians wanted, which as an American does kind of ring a bell.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. We're the worst empire. That's the thing. It's like, you know, Russia to me doesn't.
Why are we, wait, when you say we're the worst empire, so we're worse than the Russians. Oh, do you mean because we have more strength than the Russians globally? Or that if you were to give the Russians our power, do you think they would behave better than us?
Oh, no. No, God,
Okay.
no. Again, to me, look, tyranny is
So
tyranny.
what makes us worse than the Russians necessarily?
What I'm saying is you're counting how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and it doesn't matter because the truth is it's all really bad. And we are in no position in this, we are no beacon of anything.
But
in
we
this
have
country.
to pick the best option for the future of these people in the region in Eastern Europe.
No, they need to pick the best option.
But we're part of that decision-making process because they want us to be part of the decision-making process. Our sending weapons to Ukraine was all within line.
They just want the weapons. And we only want to give, like, I really wish we wanted to really help them. I wish we really did. If somebody in our government, like if our president really wanted to help them, I just think this whole thing.
Why is it such cynical that there can't be any real interest in assisting them for both selfish reasons, but also for ideological reasons?
No, there might be. That very well is true, and that could be a reason to keep it going as well. Some sort of like very misguided sense of like nationalism that isn't really going to get us anywhere strategically, instead of really just looking at what's the way to stop the bleeding and save the most people. But
can I also, when you say save the most people, what makes you so confident that if we would sign a ceasefire now, when it comes to what the Russians would do in occupied territory with the torture and the killing and all that it would be less painful for Ukraine if they were to just fight it, lose the land, and become a rump state now?
I don't know, but I don't know what that negotiation would look like for a ceasefire and for an ultimate resolution. I don't know what that would look like, but I do know that if you have people at the negotiating table that truly give a shit, that reasonable people can come to an agreement. Now, and it doesn't mean that it's all Putin and he can do whatever the hell he wants. That's not how it works. And if you were having an actual negotiation with another power, like say, the United States, that's supposedly so big and mighty and powerful, that there might be something else you can do. And I don't know what that is. I don't have the actual solution to that, but I just do not trust the motives or the incentives of the people that call the shots. And that's
can I ask one last question? I'll stop because I've been holding you for too long.
Yeah.
What would you do in a scenario where we make an offer to the Russians and we're like, fine, you can have everything you have now, right? And they say, no, we want the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk and the rest of these provinces, which we already officially announced we annexed. Is there something that would make you say, okay, the president shouldn't accept that and we should keep supporting Ukraine? The Russians' demands are just too crazy. We can't accept this.
See, here's the thing for me to answer a hypothetical, right? This is one of those things that if I were in a position of power where I had the ability to actually do something about this, I would be surrounded with a whole shit ton of more experts and information that are sitting here right now. So it's like really not, I feel like I don't know enough about it, but I do know enough that our war machine is always hungry.
You don't, I feel like there should be a level at which you're willing to walk away though, right? That should always be a standard in negotiations.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is I don't think we ever truly wholeheartedly, okay, from a position of like, if I were a person in that room, come at this like grown up sitting around and really trying to give a shit. And I do believe that if we did that, no, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not saying you don't have a hard line. I'm just saying I don't think that just keep giving Ukraine arms and military right now is going to do anything that's going to solve this. That's
it wouldn't necessarily immediately solve the war, but it would help them defend themselves better, wouldn't it?
You know what? And until how many more of them are dead? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, my understanding was from people that knew, like, I listened to some like panel of military people. My understanding was that Russia is like good until 26. So how how long are we going to like, I don't think this is the solution. That's all. And I'm open to, we'd have to have a lot more experts here and I'd have to have a lot more time to read about it. But yeah.
Dylan, it's been fun. It has, because I think that this is.
Come back and I'll school you. See, now if you were here talking about Israel, then I know a shit ton.
Gotcha.
Then I'd be able to really tell you shit.
The sad truth is that when we speak with him again down the road, it probably still will be going on.
Yeah. So come back on. When it comes to that, I'm like probably a few months shy of dissertation level.
Dylan, plug your channel, how people can find you if they want to follow your work. Obviously, we appreciate you coming on, and let's do this again sometime.
Sure, I'm always willing. Hey, I think politics would be really boring if all I did was go online and be like, yes, we agree on everything. Absolutely. I agree. That'd be very, I don't know. We wouldn't have jobs if everybody already agreed with everybody. You can find me at DylanBurnsTV for my main channel, journalistic content. I've done work covering the targeting of aid workers in Kherson, the targeting of civilians in Mykolaiv during the rescue efforts after the blowing up of the Novikhovka Dam. You guys can go check out. I'm working on a few documentaries, working on one about the dangerous lives of Ukrainian artillery crews, on civilian evacuation and civilian demining work. I lived a month with deminers in the Kharkiv Oblast and filmed their process and talked to them about their lives and what they need to get the job done to save civilians. Hope you guys check that out when I release them, and hope you guys have a great rest of your week.
Friend of the show, Chip, says, Dylan, I'm certain you're arguing in good faith. I am too.
Oh, thank you, Firmware.
That's so nice. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good end way the conversation.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a good night.